Let's dive into this with a single stark number to get us started. 76%. Keep that number in your head.
Recent polling shows that a staggering 76% of Americans cite the cost of living as their absolute biggest financial problem. And you know, this number really sets our baseline. I mean, have you felt that squeeze at the grocery store lately? If you look at the discussion surrounding this data, there's a sharp divide in how folks actually explain it. On one hand, many point the finger squarely at systemic issues, things like government-driven inflation or corporate pricing policies that make basic, everyday necessities feel like luxury items. On the flip side, critics argue it's really a profound lack of personal financial discipline, pointing out that people would much rather complain about prices than fundamentally change their spending habits. But honestly, regardless of which side of the debate you fall on, the 76% represents a very real, inescapable daily struggle for the vast majority of the country right now. People literally describe it as death by 1,000 cuts.
Which brings us to Section 1, the cost of living crisis. Let's look at exactly how working-age adults are actively dealing with this daily financial pressure.
When we dig into the primary sources, we see people managing what a lot of them are calling the monthly bleed. For example, one family did this massive deep dive into their finances, and they realized they weren't being bankrupted by huge, lavish, unpredictable expenses. Nope. Instead, they found 47 random, sub-$100 purchases in a single month. Literally death by 1,000 paper cuts. To combat this kind of thing, some folks are resorting to extreme budgeting games. There is this one deeply poignant anecdote detailing a mother who played the don't spend money game. Basically, she tried to go as many days as possible without spending a single dime after paying her first-of-the-month bills. Her record? An incredible 15 days. I mean, just think about the sheer mental load that takes. How exhausting is it to play a 15-day no-spend game just to survive? Others admit to a way more precarious strategy, just putting everything on credit cards to bridge the gap. Sure, they manage to pay the statement balance each month, but ultimately, they're saving absolutely nothing for the future.
Moving on to Section 2, the middle-class vibe shift. Because this daily financial bleed, it's causing a fundamental shift in how people perceive their own economic standing, especially among younger generations. We're seeing a total evolution of a core American concept here. Being middle class used to be defined by a tangible, predictable lack of stress. You know the deal. It meant your lifestyle was comfortably funded by your labor. Having a warm 12-pack in the garage for when your buddies show up, or taking a family vacation to the coast without panicking over the hotel bill. Today, the new reality is vastly different. It's often described as a vibe that has just vanished into thin air. Instead of comfortable stability, many feel they're competing in what's being called the struggle Olympics. It's this bizarre cultural shift where people are constantly comparing how bad they have it just to feel validated. Those old vacation funds? Yeah, they're being quietly repurposed to cover rising healthcare and education costs. The middle class has essentially shifted from a secure, deeply rooted financial status to a state of constant, humming budget anxiety.
Section 3. The empty retirement account. And here's where the dominoes really start falling in our explainer. Because when you have zero monthly margin, it triggers a massive lack of future preparation. The visual impact of this data is just a gut punch. As Americans head toward the end of their careers, nearing their 60s, nearly 4 in 10, that is 40% of the population, have absolutely zero retirement savings. Nothing. Zilch. $0. They're approaching traditional retirement age completely unshielded from the financial realities of not working. And it makes sense, right? When that daily bleed eats up every single cent you earn, there is simply nothing left to compound over time.
Now, to understand exactly how we got here, we have to look at a massive systemic shift in the American workforce. Back in the 1970s, about 45% of pre-retirement workers were covered by a company pension. That was a guaranteed, predictable benefit funded right by the employer. Today, the landscape is almost entirely dominated by 401ks and IRAs. This transition completely shifted the burden of retirement planning away from the corporation and squarely onto the shoulders of the individual. It became a market-reliant, self-funded system where your personal financial discipline and your ability to somehow scrape together extra cash from that daily bleed we talked about earlier completely determines your survival in old age.
And honestly, even for the 60% who did manage to save something, the safety net is incredibly thin. Check this out. Among the minority of 50-somethings who actually have retirement accounts, half of them have less than $87,000 saved. Think about what that actually means in practice. When you consider that a modern retirement could span 2, maybe 3 decades, $87,000 is a shockingly low figure. One major medical event, or just a few years of high inflation, could wipe that out completely, leaving a person with absolutely nothing to fall back on.
Section 4. Outliving your savings. This leads us directly into the darkest part of the domino effect, that sheer existential dread of reaching advanced age and watching the money simply disappear. When those retirement funds dry up, the options are incredibly grim. It sounds kind of clinical to list them out like this, but the reality is anything but. People are being forced to continue physically demanding manual labor well into their 70s, their bodies breaking down while they just try to make rent. Others have to move in with and entirely rely upon their adult children, which shifts that huge financial burden right down a generation. For those without family to lean on, they might become wards of the state, placed into Medicaid-funded nursing homes. And tragically, for a lot of people, the final safety net is the street. It is a devastating, highly alarming statistic that roughly 20% of the homeless population in the U.S. right now is over the age of 55.
In discussions about what happens when elderly people run out of money, one of the most common, haunting refrains you'll hear is, "Welcome to Walmart." It's a reference to the very real phenomenon of seniors taking retail greeter jobs just to afford basic survival. There are first-hand accounts in the source material of men in their 70s and 80s standing on roadsides holding stop and slow traffic signs in the blazing summer sun simply because their retirement math didn't work out. Just pause and think about that reality for a second. You work your entire life, and your reward at 78 is standing on scorching asphalt just to keep the lights on.
And the economic data translates into profound human heartbreak. Consider the 80-year-old widow whose fixed Social Security leaves her with just $620 a month after paying for a tiny studio apartment and her Medicare premiums. She is literally forced to rely on neighbors just for her daily food. Or consider the truly tragic story from our source material of a 55-year-old disabled mother who quietly stopped taking her necessary medication. She knew her ongoing health issues would financially ruin her children, so she chose to pass away, leaving behind a perfectly tidy house and saving her kids from generational debt. This right here is why understanding this data matters so much, because behind every percentage point, behind every single chart, is a real human life.
Section 5. The older wealth paradox. So the crucial point we have to ask is, how does this widespread elderly poverty coexist with the broader American economy? Well, first we have to look at the demographics to see the full picture. The size of the older generation right now is completely unprecedented in our history. In 1989, Americans aged 55 and over made up about 27% of the population. Today, that number has surged to 37%. The sheer volume of older Americans is fundamentally altering the entire economic landscape.
But here is the statistic that creates the paradox: 32%. That is the record share of all U.S. household wealth currently controlled by Americans aged 70 and older. Let that sink in for a minute. Nearly a third of the nation's wealth sits with the absolute oldest demographic.
We are looking at a true to America's reality of old age. Yes, a massive portion of the elderly population is destitute, working at retail stores just to buy groceries like we just talked about, but simultaneously, the older generation as a whole controls an absolute mountain of wealth. They benefited from decades of compounding market returns, pension plans that literally no longer exist for younger workers, and explosive real estate growth. Because of this specific demographic is single-handedly propping up U.S. consumer spending. They're the ones buying the new cars, taking the international vacations, and driving corporate earnings, all while the younger generations are stuck tracking their random sub-$100 purchases.
Which leaves us looking squarely at the future of our social contract. We have a younger generation struggling with a daily financial bleed, completely unable to save for a self-funded retirement. Meanwhile, a record concentration of wealth is locked up at the very top of the age bracket. So the big question we have to ask ourselves as we wrap up is this: what exactly happens to the American economy and to our society as a whole when this massive, highly unequal wealth transfer finally hits the next generation? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. It's been a heavy one, but an important one, and keep questioning the data.